Hi, welcome to my Prince Eye on China column. And this week, I looked into how China is reacting to the US decision to ease export restrictions on Nvidia's S20 chips. Of course, there has been a lot of discussion about AI chips, semiconductors. So, this is one of the most discussed topics on the Chinese internet. But of course, it has got a lot of attention globally, and specifically when there has been this ongoing US China tech and trade war. So, of course, on the surface, it might appear to be a positive development. It might come across as something that we are seeing that there is an ease in the US China relationships and perhaps even a diplomatic breakthrough. But that's not how it is being seen in China. The discussion on the Chinese internet is totally different. There is no a sense of relief. There's no sense of celebration vis-a-vis these ease of restrictions. And the dominant tone, what I have seen on the Chinese internet and even in the strategic community, that there is this skepticism and there is hardly any celebration about it. And of course, I will discuss how and what they're discussing, what are the major reasons and rationale behind this distrust, this skepticism. But it all started with last month Nvidia's founder and CEO Jensen Huang visit to Beijing, and where he actually announced that the US had approved exports of the S20 chip to China. So, of course, at first glance, this seemed like a gesture of cooperation, a possible easing of tensions between the two countries. But in China, response was far from warm. And from Beijing's point of view, this wasn't a gesture of goodwill. It was a calculated move by the US. It was a way to maintain influence over China's tech ecosystem and show its path to independence. And then the discussion is also about on the risk of depending on the continued over reliance on American technology in critical infrastructure. And online discussions in China rapidly move from technical issues to broader geopolitical distrust. So, of course, it's all weaved into how there has been this mutual distrust, how there has been this idea that US has to stop Chinese supremacy, US has to stop the advancement, the progress that China has been making in the military front, on the military front, in the technological field. But I think much more than military, technological field has become something where the US feels that it has to stop the Chinese progress, the progress that has been made within China. And here's the key question that kept emerging within the Chinese discourse. And the question is, can China truly trust American technology, especially when US laws may allow for backdoors, surveillance, or even remote shutdown features? So in mid July, the announcement was made by Jensen Huang. And just after a few days, on July 31st, China Cyberspace Administration summoned Nvidia over concerns that the S20 chip might include GPS tracking, unauthorized data access, and remote disabling capabilities. And just the next day, there was an editorial in the Chinese edition of People's Daily that actually became viral and that warned of national security risk tied to the US made chip. So there was a call for China to reconsider importing the US chips and what are the vulnerabilities that China will be exposed to. And one major sticking point is that the Nvidia, despite its global presence, still a US company. And no matter what its intention are, maybe good intentions, but it is still bound by American legislation, like the Chips and Science Act. And for many in China, that alone makes the product inherently unreliable. And in fact, one user bluntly put it, one commentator, that if a chip must follow US rules, it cannot be trusted, period. And this is a common viewpoint across all the platforms. And another analogy that struck a chord online likened the situation to buying a lock while the seller keeps a master key. So there is hardly any privacy. In other words, any dependence on the US chips could quickly become a vulnerability, could quickly become a strategic risk in the longer term. But of course, the discussion has been triggered by this NVIDIA announcement, by the NVIDIA development. But this is a concern that has been there within the Chinese government psyche, within the online community for a very, very long time. And Chinese commentators have long accused the US of playing a double game. They say that the U.S. has blocked Chinese companies like Huawei under the guise of national security, spying while exporting its own surveillance-capable hardware globally. So the Chinese commentators, online users, have been accusing the U.S. of exercising this technological duplicity and the double standard. They have been accusing the US of having double standards, specifically with respect to the technological cooperation between China and the US. So, what they want is they want access to the Chinese market, but they're actually not giving the access to the US market to the Chinese company, and is not going unnoticed within the Chinese discourse. So Shan Yi, who is a renowned professor at Fudan University, also argues that perhaps this is the time for focus on more self-reliance. And relying on US technology is unwise as well as perilous, strategically dangerous for China at this point. And across platforms like Weibo, WeChat, the sentiment is clear, the message is clear that foreign tech can be disabled or weaponized. And the only long term solution is to reduce dependence altogether. And China has to be self reliant, self sufficient, and there is no way other than that. Then one Weibo post that gained a lot of traction claimed that the US only resumed chip sales to flood the Chinese market before local alternatives can become competitive. After seeing that China is actually there is a catch up from the Chinese side. So, this is the reason why they are selling the S20 chips, which are not the most advanced chips. So, this is just one of the major reasons, according to the Chinese perspective, is that they want to pollute, they want to uh, fill the Chinese market with the US not so sophisticated and not so advanced chips. And other argued for retaliatory tariffs and tighter protection for domestic firms. Now there's also a growing push to allow previously banned US chips but restrict newly approved ones, particularly those seen as Trojan horses. And administrative protection, many believe in China, is vital for long term resilience. And in fact, this sentiment was also echoed by the former editor in chief of the Global Times, Hu Shichen, who actually dismissed the return of the H20 chip as anything that is generous from the US side, and he instead called it a calculated move to slow China's tech momentum. So this is, as I've said before, that this is not something that is considered an area of cooperation or something that is emanating from goodwill, or this is not something that US is doing to strengthen or to normalize, manage relationship with China. This is another strategic trap from the US side. So, when seen through this lens, NVIDIA's return isn't really about cooperation. What Chinese are viewing is through the lens of containment, that this is more about containment than cooperation. And this episode has only strengthened the push within China for complete technological self reliance. And in fact, there is an analyst, an engineer analyst in China who has been talking about chip cooperation and self reliance in China, Ni Kuan, and he has been warning China for it has to push for more self reliance. And he says that specifically after this episode, that unless China controls the entire semiconductor chain, it will remain exposed, it will remain vulnerable, and the US will be more advantageous in a more advantageous position. And for Nvidia, the stakes could not be higher. For Nvidia, China still remains a major market, especially for the AI chips. But being present is no longer enough. It isn't about being able to sell the chips to the Chinese market. It's also about credibility and trust. And what China wants is that credibility and trust, and how Nvidia operates within the Chinese market has to be on the Chinese terms. And meanwhile, Chinese firms are accelerating their efforts to build a robust domestic semiconductor industry. And outside China, countries like specifically India, are closely watching and learning as they shape their own strategies for chip development. As specifically India is on its own semiconductor mission. So this is no longer just about the US and China rivalry. This isn't just a China US issue. It is a part of a wider contest wider competition over technological sovereignty. So, digital sovereignty is something that the Chinese internet uses. The Chinese scholars have been talking about that China has to master. So, chips are no longer just seen as components. They are now becoming strategic assets. And the saying that chips are the new oil is something that we have been hearing for a very, very long time. And China is making sure that it controls its own mainly by developing a fully domestic semiconductor industry. But for now, if we just look at the easing of the US China tensions, if we look at the easing of the tech rivalry, this is absolutely not a sign of any easing of US China tech tension. And if we believe the Chinese discourse, this is becoming much more complicated and much more contested. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next week.